Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. I'm pleased to welcome Hans-Georg Mueller today. You know him by his prolific work online, and he's a professor. Oh, I guess I don't need to. I'm not sure if I don't think I need to give introductions. Everything's in the public. Uh, what I found Hans's work extremely useful, uh, very timely. Him and his co-author of um, You and Your Profile, his latest book, uh, present like a extremely timely and helpful vocabulary or set of distinctions for discussing contemporary tensions brought on by our emerging media environments. In particular, his focus on the accomplishment of identity in these new conditions, I found extremely well put. And I'm in a milieu. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto that I don't think has caught up to these new conditions and the tensions of identity. And so I very much appreciate your work, and I'm spreading it far and wide. And just to contextualize things a little bit, Peter ran this session, Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa, ran this session about second selfing. And I found a lot of the concepts and that were very similar to the ones that you brought up. So this tension between the person and the persona is something that a lot of people are feeling, and I think your work is very helpful for us navigating that. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Hans to present some of his work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khalil, for your kind introduction. I guess I'm just presenting with the PowerPoint I prepared like for 20 minutes or something, and then we have discussion. That's the idea, right? Okay, so I'll do that. Let me just try to get my PowerPoint. Just open it. Share screen.
So everyone in the session today, just make a note of the questions that you have in the chat, and then I'll go through them and ask. Maybe if you want to ask the question yourself, I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Or if you want me to ask the question on your behalf, let me know when you're writing the question out. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my PowerPoint actually? Okay, is it moving? Also moving. Okay, then I'll just start. So this is the cover of the book that Khalil already mentioned that was published last year. It's co-written with Paul D'Ambrosio, and the title is You and Your Profile, Identity After Authenticity. And I'll just give you a short overview of the main ideas and concepts that are outlined in the book. The first set of concepts we work with is sincerity and authenticity. Actually, sorry, I'm going to close the window. There is some noise coming outside. Sorry about that. As tourists coming again to Macau. So we've opened up recently after COVID, as you may have heard. So we have the sets of concepts, sincerity and authenticity, that we started with. And these are taken actually from Lionel Trilling, who wrote a book in 1972 titled Sincerity and Authenticity. And so we take these two concepts from him. They're actually kind of simple concepts. So sincerity points to a mental and social method of achieving personal identity. I like to call it an identity technology based on sincere role enactment. So you commit to a role. and then enact the role and identify with it. And this was typically in the old days, and still is in some societies, many actually. Basically, you're born in, happens by being born into a certain role, and then a social role, and then you grow up, and then you identify it. So this was one's gender, of course, and then also one's tribal or ethnic identity, one's social class, one's profession, one's religion, all these things one was basically born into. So identification, therefore, then consisted in committing to these roles that people just found themselves in, and you would embrace the norms and internalize the values that are attached to these roles. And typically the family was the core social unit where such sincere identity was experienced, developed, and then also confirmed by others, by your other family members, for instance, who confirm your whatever role as mother or father. And of course, sincerity is still practiced today. For instance, we still have families, at least many people still live in families. But then also you can think of other, social realms like sports or religious communities or military contexts as well, where such role commitment is still very important and very formative. And here's a picture that basically illustrates this. Basically all about these people is attached to their role identity, the way they dress, where they sit, on the photo, and the way they behave and everything. That's all basically informed by the role, and so the photo expresses strongly this role commitment. Then the second concept is authenticity. So the idea is that in modernity, social mobility posed a challenge to these traditional roles. Now it was much less evident that one needed to commit to these roles one was born into, because there were lots of alternatives. And in this sense, we can say identity now became a problem. It wasn't really almost ready-made at birth, but something that you basically needed to either discover or create. And then, so we follow Trilling by saying that authenticity is a form of identity based, it's a quote, on the idea that somewhere under all these roles, there is me, that poor old ultimate actuality, who, when all the roles have been played, would like to murmur off few landings and settle down with his original actual self. So we have this kind of pursuit of originality that is at the core of authenticity. And the standard kind of metaphor for this is the mask, right? The role is now perceived as, the roles are perceived as masks. And the idea is that you need to find your true self or to develop it, to create it by shedding this mask. And so this is an image representing authenticity. Now, we're not defending authenticity, we're just analyzing it. And we see, as with all, Paul and I, see these paradoxes and problems as well in authenticity. So this pursuit of authenticity, originality, is of course also a type of conformity, right? You learn it and copy it from your culture, if you're born into a culture of authenticity, as most of probably among us today, if at least if we're not that young. And I saw from the images that most of us are kind of already a little bit advanced in age, so we are all very familiar with authenticity, and that's our culture. So it's also a form of conformity, because we just conform to the expectations by pursuing originality. And then, of course, authenticity also seeks for social validation. It's therefore dependent on others, which is also paradoxically, right? Paradox is also a paradox, right? Because your originality is not, or doesn't really originate, the origin isn't really just yourself, right? There's social validation that's very important for it as well. And then authenticity demands the discovery or creation of a true self. And that's somehow in continuation of what could be called a traditional illusion, at least from a scientific perspective, of the existence of a soul, right? From a scientific perspective, and I guess also from a philosophical perspective, from my own kind of philosophical perspective, this concept of something like a soul is very fishy. I'm informed by Buddhism and specifically of Taoism, and this concept of the self there is something that is very much doubted. Now, the idea is then that we've actually moved on from authenticity, and that we're now in a period where we transition away from authenticity towards what we call profilicity or profile-based identity. So that's the main thesis of the book, that we are basically now at the beginning of, let's say, an age of profilicity. Charles Taylor, the philosopher, Canadian philosopher, coined the notion of the age of authenticity. So the idea is that the age of authenticity is ending and the age of profilicity is beginning. So authenticity, of course, also strongly relies on personal interaction. But in the virtual world we inhabit today, the space where we are meeting right now, real life interaction has, of course, become less important. And that's in all segments of society, not just in, philosophy right now, but where we are now, but also in the economy and art, academics, politics, you name it. So importantly, now we take this other concept by Niklas Luhmann, a German sociologist, that this means that society has almost entirely switched to second order observation. So this means that we do not simply look at people or issues directly, but rather at how they are seen publicly by others. And that's basically a profile. So we observe observers. Whatever, to judge a restaurant, we look at its reviews on Yelp, and then we later judge our experience in reference to what we have read. And we've developed this ability to judge products, and Khalil was already, like in his introduction, referring to my profile, basically, because we had never met before, but he knew a lot of things about me. And so he was referring precisely to my profile. So he knew me through my profile. And he also gave an example, his introduction, that he developed the ability to judge me, just similar to how we judge, for instance, products in terms of brands, or universities in terms of their rankings, or our colleagues in terms of where they publish or are cited if we are in the academic industry, and everything basically in terms of its profile. So we learn to see things in this way, and we also learn, therefore, also to show ourselves in this very same manner. We form identity through the curation of profiles, and we have to. So profiles are images of ourselves presented for second-order observation. By looking at them, others can see how we like to be seen as being seen. And therefore, we create and show pictures looking like this one. All right, this is a kind of Instagram style picture, which is obviously not taken spontaneously, but is curated and then put on, on social media for others to see. And in this way, the taking and the posting of pictures like this is all part of what could be called profile work, and presenting an identity and curating an identity and shaping an identity in the course of that activity. So let me talk a little bit more about the notion of second order observation. These are a few quotes from Niklas Luhmann from his book, Introduction to Systems Theory. Just 3 quotes, I'll read them. The observation of the observers, and that's a shift from a consciousness of reality to a description of descriptions, or the perception of what others say or do not say, has become the advanced mode of perceiving the world in modern society. Importantly, even though the English translation was published in 2014, Luhmann died in 1998, and this book was, I think, actually is from the early 1990s. And so this predates the internet. That's important, predates social media. As we know it. That was, of course, in an infant stage already there, but that was not what Luhmann was talking about. He wasn't talking about the internet. He was talking about general move towards second order observation that had already taken place. For instance, I always refer to this because it's the most kind of obvious example, to branding, right? The shift from just selling things to creating and curating brands. And basically, so this shift, economic shift, marketing shift towards brands is a shift towards second order observation. And that long predates, of course, the internet by quite a long time. So the internet and social media as we use it, that's a core hypothesis, is not didn't create Profilicity, but it functions in the way it functions, and it flourished in the way it flourished because Profilicity was already there, and it could sort of enhance Profilicity, and that's why it took off in the way it did. The second quote here, to go back to Luhmann, you get your information on the facts merely by looking at what others have to say about it. So. And then again, we no longer need to know what the world is like once we know how it is being seen, and once we are capable of orienting ourselves in the realm of second order observation. So this is a core phrase, that's why I highlighted here, right? We have to be capable of orienting ourselves in the realm of second order observation, and we are. And a very important part of orienting ourselves in the realm of second order observation is also to shape our own identity in the realm of second order observation. So that's what Profilicity is. It's identity building under conditions of pervasive second order observation. And here you can see another photo that depicts second order observation. And now here, of course, it's related to social media. These two pictures were taken at a theme park in China. And you see in 2010, people were still watching a performance, and they directly without their cell phones. And now, of course, in 2017, everyone's watching the performance and at the same time filming the performance, with the idea, of course, to then somehow post or share it on social media. And you can see, of course, a very striking difference in the expressions on the faces, except for the small girl at the bottom of the picture and the 2017 pictures, who's the only one who doesn't have a camera. So she's not yet kind of grown up into this, even though, of course, now often kids that age also use cell phones. So you can see, of course, a very different expression in the faces, and that shows, you could say, kind of somehow maybe it's sad because they're not like as happy looking as the people in 2010. But I would just say it's more like you can also see a certain intensity, of course, in 2017, right? Everyone's very focused, and everyone's kind of also absorbed. And I would just highlight the increased level of complexity that we see in the 2017 pictures, right? Where everyone's basically already operating and acting and thinking in the mode of second order observation, right? They very much see and act and observe something already in the mode of as it is being observed by others who in this case are not present. So observing the observation, and this kind of this is yeah, as I just said, it's a different level of complexity that we moved on, that we are in, and I think this has now become kind of widespread. All right, so a short kind of conclusion. What do we take from this? Well, according to our view, Paul and mine, we're not defending authenticity. Many reactions towards social media and the rise of Profilicity, even if they don't use the term Profilicity, kind of develop some sort of authenticity nostalgia and say, okay, there's this loss of authenticity, and we somehow have to return to authenticity. Because that's what we're used to, right? But according to our view, we don't think that any identity mode is inherently better, or for that matter, more true than any other. They all become more or less functional under different social conditions. So they reflect the social conditions we're living in, and they somehow fit these social conditions. I should maybe also highlight here, even though it's not on the slide, that the loss of authenticity or sincerity is not complete. When we move on to Profilicity, we still, as I just said at the beginning, can operate in sincerity, right? We still, as you know, family, sports, military, whatever, which are basically based on sincerity, and we still also operate authentically, interact authentically at times. But we nevertheless now, very important part, maybe the main part of our identity formation, increasingly so, is in the form of profilicity. So again, that's why we do not think that anyone is truer or better, but they all more or less functional under different social conditions. But generally, and this is for us important, identity is a necessary socio-psychological construct. It's needed for our world to function as it does, our society, but also our, you know, as individuals, as people, we need a sense of identity. But at the same time, it's always incongruent, right? We do not think that there is something like a soul. So there are different elements of our existence, our bodies, our minds, our social personas, and they're not kind of centered, and they're not kind of coherent, right? They are contingent, right? It's contingent, whatever our bodies are contingent, our social class and so forth is all contingent, and it's incongruent. And it's also inherently stressful, in the sense that, again, identity is not something that's there, but something that we have to build, construct, that we have to invest in emotionally, intellectually, emotionally, of course, but in many ways we have to constantly invest in it. It's constantly challenged. We have to defend it. We have to project it successfully and so forth. It's a struggle. No matter which mode you're in or which technology you apply, it's work. So in sincerity, there's a strong role conformity pressure, right? For everyone involved. I mean, the roles are typically hierarchical, whatever the gender roles, right? So, but also even if you're in the hierarchically higher position, whatever, like traditionally like male patriarchic society, right? There's not just pressure on women, there's also pressure on men to be manly. Then in authenticity, we have this hyper-individualism pressure, right? Everyone's supposed to be original, right? You have to tell your children all the time how special they are. And then, of course, there's this pressure to be special. And that's a big pressure. And then, of course, in Profilicity, we have this pursuit of a high profile, and you have to update the profile all the time, right? And you're in competition with other profiles. So therefore, sincerity, authenticity, and of course also profilicity, if zealously pursued, can very much threaten individual and social sanity, and have always been threatening individual and social sanity. And so this is the final slide. Paul and I use this notion of genuine pretending. That's our previous book. We have this both this background in Taoist philosophy. And so we think that basically Taoism's existential position is genuine pretending. Now, that's our term, the notion of genuine pretending, but we think that, again, that is kind of an existential idea that is expressed in the core Taoist text that we've been working with. So what does it mean? So it means that instead of trying to do the impossible, namely getting identity right, which we always, no matter which technology, you want to have, you want to be, right in your role, whatever, as father or mother, right? And so you want to get your identity right, but you also want to get your identity right in authenticity, right? You want to be your true self and not your fake self. And then you want to have the right profile, right? And not the wrong profile. So, but then again, we believe that identity is inherently incongruent. So basically, it's impossible to get your identity, essentially right. The point is instead, rather than, engaging in this basically impossible pursuit of getting your identity right, to understand that identity is, again, what we call genuinely pretended. It's a contingent and temporary social construct. So we pretend, in the sense of also child play, right? We pretend, and either in the mode of authenticity or sincerity or profilicity, but then of course our pretense, our performance also becomes genuine. And that's very important to understand, that genuine doesn't precede the pretense, but that genuine paradoxically is an effect of the enactment of an identity. And we can then achieve and genuinely identify with a role or with an original self or with a profile. And all these modes offer this possibility, but we should understand that this genuineness is not something that is somehow right, but that is something that is performatively constructed. So it's a contingent and temporary social construct. And in this way, we need to form a psychological and social sense of self through this performance, and then we can succeed in forming this psychological and social sense of self, and then the performance becomes genuine. So in this way, every mode of identity can make us, or does make us, experience selfhood. We all have a very strong sense of self, at least I hope, otherwise we might have problems to exist. But at the same time, we can know, and we can reflect and understand that this selfhood doesn't really match up all the incongruent dimensions of human life, and that it really doesn't correspond to an essential self, like a soul or something like this. So, and to understand this kind of, let's say, contingency and at the same time genuineness of our selfhood, that's genuine pretending. And we can realize that basically we are, and everyone is, genuine pretending all the time. And that opens up a critical awareness of the contingencies of selfhood. And that's then the main effect, which is something that Taoism strongly emphasizes, that ends up in a sort of an easing of identity, that your identity becomes something that you don't kind of, you enact your identity in a playful way. You can have a kind of a form of ease in your selfhood. So that's the idea. These are the basic ideas of the book, and I stopped sharing. All right. Should have stopped this.
Thanks for that presentation. Again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll look over them. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask maybe one or two of them and then I'll look into the chat. So I have questions. I have one about the general pair, which you didn't bring up in this presentation, but maybe I have one about institutions. What type of new institutions happen downstream of this new form of identity formation? I'm wondering which type of, what do you want to talk about more about the general pair? You want to introduce that and I can ask a question about that. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to talk about the general peer. So the general peer is another notion that we use in the book, and that is related to the notion of profilicity. So as I mentioned a few times when talking about sincerity, authenticity, and profilicity, these are, of course, always enacted in some form of public. And sincerity typically is formed and shaped and is validated. That's very important. The validation comes from your actual present peers, whatever, in the family, your other family members confirm your role and must confirm it. And if they don't, then that's a problem. And actually that is still here in China, at least until a few decades ago. Unfortunately, also, whatever, a main reason of suicide, right? That the present peers do not really confirm the role that a person has. And then people feel whatever, slighted and so forth. And the same, whatever, in sports and in military and so forth, if you're not respected by your present peers, then that causes a major problem. And then, of course, we have in authenticity the idea that you need to be, that's Hegel's idea, philosophically speaking, that you need to be recognized. You need recognition, and this recognition basically has to come from another authentic individual. Whatever, we have the notion of the soulmate. right? That's very important. And so if you're like operating and identifying in the mode of authenticity, then you're constantly searching for your soulmates and their recognition of you, and thereby the confirmation of your own authenticity. Basically, can only come, the confirmation of authenticity can only come from another authentic individual. From the perspective of authenticity, there are also paradoxes. But anyways, and then we get to profilicity, and that's a general peer, right? You need a kind of validation must come from the general peer. The example I gave in the talk of whatever, you go to a restaurant and the identity of the restaurant has to be confirmed not by your family or friends. If your family write positive reports, that doesn't really count, right? That's kind of a cheating. And it's not just about, one authentic soulmate that confirms, that you're a good restaurant. You need a confirmation by as many, you need to garner as many likes as possible. And to give you another example, more like closer, Khalil, you're also a PhD student, you said, right, in the academic industry, as I like to call it. We have these very centrally, this kind of blind peer review process, right? So that's also kind of interesting, right? You get your confirmation. That's only accounts. Your academic identity is supposed to be confirmed by blind peer review. So people are supposed neither to act sincerely, where kind of personal knowledge is very important, right? So traditionally, whatever, if you were a philosopher, you get your validation from, for instance, your students who are whatever. Played Socrates or Plato in the academy, right? Their role as a philosopher has to be confirmed by those who are present, right? And as they know, and then of course, then they have to respect them as wise people, right? So that would be in the mode of sincerity, and they accept them as the wise teacher. Or then later, whatever you're a young philosopher and whatever, you're 16 or so, and you talk to your friends, and then you get the validation of your self as a philosopher from the other kind of authentic teenagers you're hanging out with. But that's not the case, not supposed to be nowadays in the academic industry. You need basically to write your papers and thereby to develop yourself in the face of a general peer, an anonymous, let's say, social sphere that is defined basically through its anonymity. And this is what counts. And so whatever, in order to become a successful academic, you need a lot of citations. And what counts is the number of citations, right? Not exactly who, it doesn't matter who really individually are the citations. It just matters that the citations are, for instance, in highly ranked journals, right? That your essays are being quoted in highly ranked journals. So you look at, again, second order observation, you look at whatever the ranking of the journal, and then you look where the citations come from and so forth. That's a general peer, right? And that is the general peer is a kind of a public under conditions of second order observation in the mode of profilicity. And increasingly, in all our social spheres, I just mentioned the social sphere that I'm acting in most of my time, namely the academic industry, we talk to, we write, we communicate towards a general peer, right? And therefore we shape an identity. I shape my professional identity, and I need to get validated. I hope for validation by this general peer, right? So the general peer, the notion, we took it a little bit with allusion to the general will, Rousseau's traditional notion, right? Which is also not an individual will, right? That's the whole point, that it's not something that you can sort of, it's not the sum of the individuals, right? It is something that is that only exists in the general category, so to speak, right? And so the general peer is a general peer that cannot be reduced to single individuals. So that's why it's non-authentic, but it's also non-sincere. It's prophilic, but it's not fake, right? The citations you get and is not fake, and the ranking of the journals and so forth, this is all very real, right? So it shouldn't be confused just because it's non-authentic and non-sincere. That's often I think, a mistake that's being made, that it's regarded as fake. The general peer is very real.
Oh, okay. So I have a good question about, maybe not a good question, but a question about that. So, okay, so we're in this paradigm of profilicity, and comparatively to other paradigms of identity formation, it's more technologically mediated,
Sure.
right? So that it has a maybe a certain type of contingency, but not merely contingent, because now there are people who control this technologies that are not us in a very real way. So then there might be a possibility to engineer the general will. Uh, and so I'm wondering how, because you write that this condition of profilicity is inherently democratic, but I'm wondering if you can have an outsized influence on the general will. For example, I'll give you an example. Maybe this is a bad example or politically explosive example, but Justin Trudeau, I remember when the trucker protest was happening, he just kind of threw a bunch of epithets at these people. You know, they're racist, misogynist, and I met people who believed him. Like, oh, they're all racist, misogynists. They don't want to go along with this vaccine thing. So, they're homophobes, etc. And so he was kind of, and that's what everyone believed. Everyone else believed, and then there's this pressure. There's an asymmetry of force that may even produce preference falsification, right? So maybe the profilicity is not necessarily democratic, but socially democratic, if you get what
Right.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's your response to that? I'm wondering, and I'll go to other people's
Very good
questions.
point, Khalil. So I take that back, even though I wrote it that it's inherently democratic. I agree with you. And so, of course, this is totally true, right? I mean, we see politics and power very much also operating in this mode, which always has been like, and it's about reputation and profile shaping. And political contests are very much profile contests, right? And it's so obvious, right? Whatever. Always the example, Trump and so forth, right? There's very little ideology. It shifts all the time. It's completely incoherent. Doesn't really represent anyone except for his own profile, right? And the same, of course. So now we see this, also internationally, whatever, China, right? The China profile has changed so much, right? It was very positive in the 1990s. Now we're at the brink of a third world war, and a big part of it is, how the China profile, was kind of altered. And so, yes, definitely. I mean, profiles, be it of individual politicians and profiles or whatever, protest movements, profiles of whole kind of, geopolitical actors. It's very much a profile contest that's going on. And yeah, I fully agree with you. Now, of course, this is somehow, has always somehow been the case, right? I mean, profiles, you could say, but in this sense, traditionally, maybe this idea, it was also important somehow to, in the past, what I'm thinking of, let's say, whatever, you have traditional wars, and then it's also important to somehow construct an image of your opponents in a negative way. And maybe that's a kind of a predecessor, maybe a form of a predecessor of what we witness today. Then, yeah, profile shaping has become very much a centerpiece, and maybe to an extent always has been in political power contests and all kinds of levels. I agree.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I guess that's what blockchain is trying to create second order observation that's more valid or something like that. All right,
Right.
I have one more question and then I'll go to. I was wondering if you can go maybe 15 minutes after the hour, or you have a hard cutoff at the hour.
No, it's fine.
Okay, thanks.
We can do like go like my time. It would be 11:15, no problem.
Okay, thank you. One more question I had. Yes, about new, because you've been critical of academic industry, and you talked about how the Agora is online these days, and you you enter these spaces. And here, this is a Stoa, right? Not an Agora, but adjacent to it. Um, Wondering how do you think this untethering of identity from place, right? Because that's what it is, right? Kind of, in a sense, right? These how that is going to affect the next institutions, future institutions, or is the university going to be obsolete? Have you thought about things like that, or not? Not really.
Well, I mean, yeah, of course, I think about it. Whatever, in my own life, I'm kind of now. That's why we're meeting here, right? I'm mostly known through my videos on YouTube. More people know me there than academically. And so I get invited to things like this, which I didn't get invited to in the normal university setting. And so far, I'm enjoying this more than the academic industry. So I don't mind it at all, right? It's a good experience. I'm glad this is happening. And so if I enjoy it, why wouldn't others enjoy it as well, right? So, and the university under influence of capitalism, of course, very importantly, but then also under the influence of profilicity has become this industry, has radically been transformed from how I experienced as a student back in Germany in the last century. And it has become an industry, and a tough industry. And yeah, so I think this kind of switch to other forms of intellectual exchange is not a bad thing. So the traditional university should be, or the university now, should be understood as what it is, namely as an industry. And I mean, Luhmann, I like to refer to Luhmann, the sociologist, he defined the function of the education system, in which the university is, of course, very central, as providing selection criteria for careers. Not as, shaping people, educating them, Bildung, that's their traditional idea, what the university should do. But actually, the university doesn't do that mainly. What the university does is it creates selection criteria for careers. And the whole system is geared towards the production of these selection criteria for careers. And we should understand that this is what the university is right now. And everyone who's taking part in it professionally, that's at the center of what they are doing. That's something that needs to be recognized more, I think. And the universities, like whatever, you look at the self-descriptions of universities or philosophy departments. I did a video on this, right? How philosophy departments market themselves. They basically lie. And what philosophy academically is about. So that they attract customers who want to, improve their selection criteria for careers. So yeah, and another thing, whatever, like I did the recent video, like on ChatGPT, and there's a lot of discussion now. I just read a new article in South China Morning Post yesterday, and many people now make the point that I was also basically trying to. I actually welcome ChatGPT because it kind of threatens the university in a way that it can't just go on the way it does. It shows the hypocrisy, right? So maybe it challenges the university to kind of an academia and by extension philosophy to somehow reinvent itself, and maybe the stuff that we are doing here is a kind of a reinvention of philosophy outside of the academic system, because the academic system has become an academic industry, and I'm not sure that's the best place, for instance, for doing philosophy.
Thanks for that response. I'm going to get to some questions in the chat. Celia has a really good question that I wanted to know more about. So maybe I'll ask her to ask her question first.
Hi, this is Ciela. My question is around what the psychological effects, if any, around this transition that you're seeing.
Well, I guess there are massive psychological effects. And I'm not a psychologist, so I don't really, I cannot really, give you like a very competent analysis of it. But what I found interesting, I don't know if you know Jonathan Haidt. He's like a famous psychologist, sociologist. And he has a lot of videos recently or conversations on YouTube where he talks about this kind of very tragic increase of suicide and depression of teenagers, and specifically teenage girls, and age like around 12 to 15 or 10 to 15. I don't remember the exact age, but that's more or less the age bracket, something between 10 and 15. And there's like kind of extremely sharp increase around 2012 or so. Both in North America and in Western Europe. So he relates it directly to the use of social media, and specifically media, because it's specifically among girls that are more used by girls than by boys. And that's like Instagram, where people like very strongly profile-oriented social media, right? Where the whole medium is basically about the creation of this profile. And then obviously a lot of the girls kind of get into very severe psychological crisis, and they somehow are unable to shape their profiles, that's how I would, they have like suffer from the profile pressure. That's how I would put it. That's what I assume what happens. So we see that, as I said, like a main cause for, probably the main cause for suicide in any kind of identity technology is that you're not successful in developing an identity, and you don't get validation, and you fear that your identity is not validated. And I think that's also an potential explanation for this kind of psychological problem. So what we see is, as in all these other systems, all these other technologies, sorry, that they, it's not easy to shape a sense of identity, and particularly teenagers, that's their kind of their main concern. They have to develop their identity, and that's their main task. And then there can be easily social problems of developing an identity, and yeah, the crises are different, right? If you live in a sincerity culture, in a traditional sincerity culture, it's all about honor, and you're constantly worried about honor and these things. And then you might whatever, get into a crisis or kill yourself or kill others of your family because you think that something dishonorable, some person is dishonorable, was not honorable. And now we have our psychological worries and our psychological crisis are no longer related to role identities, but to profile identities. That doesn't mean it's necessarily worse essentially than any of these other identity technologies, as I said earlier. But we should understand that these new, let's say, psychological challenges are related to, I suppose, the emergence of profilicity, and they're profilicity related rather than sincerity, or also rather than authenticity related. And probably, and that's my guess regarding also Haidt, that Haidt still thinks there are somehow the problem is authenticity related. because we still tend to think, especially if we are, like, as I said earlier, relatively old and we all grew up in an authenticity, we have this authenticity nostalgia. So we still tend to see things all in terms of authenticity, and authenticity as the ideal that has to be pursued. And so I think there's also, regarding this problem of the teenage suicide wave and depression wave, that we don't really support the kids, that we still expect them to be authentic, and that we kind of put even more pressure onto them, that we kind of think, oh, they should be authentic, there's something wrong with them. We want to help them to become more authentic. And we would cure them if they would be, they would be cured if they just would be truly authentic. And I think that's the wrong way. We should be, we should very well understand the problems of profilicity, but I don't think we can help the kids if we tell them, which kind of Haidt does, right? Haidt just says, my own kids, I just don't allow them to use social media until they're 16, which I understand, and I also think is highly problematic. But still, I think underlying this approach is the idea they have to be authentic. Well, you also have to learn to be prophilic without suffering from it. I think that's, and authenticity is not the right identity, and prophilicity is not the wrong identity. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so that brings up to mind. So here at the Stoa, I guess you're not just satisfied of like adapting. We want to thrive, right? So in that spirit, I would ask Peter if you would like to ask his question.
Thanks, Han, for this presentation. This is really great. And thank you, Khalil, for introducing me to Han's work. It's really helped advance my thinking. And my question's on online identity, so I'll just read it. I wrote it out. With one's online identity or second self, one existential choice I see is creating a second self as a work of art, or creating it as a supernormal stimuli, a term evolutionary biologists use to describe a stimulus that elicits a greater response than the stimulus for which it evolved. So for example, is porn. The former, the art, is aimed to be beautiful, the latter aimed to be hot, and I sense the former creates co-agency while the latter creates parasocial codependency, which is affected to sell things, including one's ego. So I'm curious what you think of this framing and how you see being artful with one's identity or second self relate with this notion of genuine pretending.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I read your piece on the second self, and I very much agree with that. And the second self, of course, is very similar to profile, right? So as you say, I mean, it's a piece of art and it's creative, and so I'm all for a kind of affirming, finding ways to affirm the profile or the second self, while at the same time not over-investing in the second self, right? And so I think there is a chance, and that's in the way you describe the second self, or as I would say, the profile, maybe more than the other modes of identity, that we are capable at the same time identifying with the second self, but doing so playfully, that we understand it's genuine pretending, right? That we understand that it is a creation, that it's contingent, that it's a work of art, as you say. And I think that's somehow easier in the mode of prophilicity than it is to understand the contingency and the artistic element in creating the self than in the modes of sincerity or in the modes of authenticity, where we overestimate the essentiality of the self. And that causes a lot of problems. So I think the second self has less danger of mistaking it for being essential. And because I think mistaking the self for being essential is at the heart, to go back to the earlier question, of the psychological problems, right? If we become identity fundamentalists, that is both personally, individually, and socially, collectively problematic. So with the second self, there's maybe the chance to be less of identity fundamentalists, right? And to be less concerned with kind of complete role commitment as we are in sincerity, and less concerned with this kind of hyper individualism that we have in authenticity, which I also think is very problematic and has caused all kinds of problems. This kind of overemphasis on on individuality and individualism that we have in the highly individualist societies in North America and Western Europe, which are also, I think, full of pathologies. And so at least there's a chance with a second self to maybe a higher chance to as in your terminology, to take it as a work of art.
It reminds me very much of what I've read about Goethe. He seemed like a very artful, genuine pretender from what I've read about. So next question, I'm just going to try to make these themes transition. Well, okay, let's go with Matthew Arnold. If you'd like to ask your question, or if you want me to ask it.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
So my question is in regards to multiple pseudonymous profiles, their potential effect on people. Because I was wondering whether there was, I was saying in the chat that I attended an event, it was called Vibe Camp about a year ago. I noticed everybody there was from Twitter, and they all said that they had different alts on Twitter in which they presented themselves, I think genuinely presenting like you're talking about, but in different senses of themselves. Like they were somehow able to occupy different views. And it was so heterodox there. I noticed when they would walk in, a lot of people I knew from Twitter would walk into different rooms and they'd seem to adopt whatever the worldview or the vibe was of that. I don't know whether there's some skill that's being developed in Profilicity in genuinely pretending to be able to adopt multiple different ways of relating or multiple different systems. Have you seen anything about that?
That's also a very important point. I think, again, that's a problem where we are too much kind of prejudiced in the mode of authenticity, right? Paul quotes this, my co-author, I don't know if it's in the book or in an article. I think it's in the book. I think Mark Zuckerberg, right, said, oh, we don't want people to have multiple Facebook accounts, right? They should only have one so that their true self, right, is there. But of course, that's that's authenticity prejudice, right? And it has nothing to do with our actual reality. We need multiple profiles, not necessarily multiple Facebook accounts, but we need different profiles on different in different social settings, right? My professional profile, my academic profile shouldn't be and cannot be the same as my Facebook profile, right? It doesn't work, and that doesn't mean that I'm less genuine academic than I'm I'm genuine. Each sphere allows, again, the potential for becoming genuine, right? And that was kind of completely normal back in sincerity, right, where you also had multiple roles. You were at the same time a mother and a daughter, right? And they come, and it's kind of course expected that you act very differently as a mother towards your children than you act as a daughter towards your parents. And that comes with a role, and no one would expect, oh, now she's acting so different to her sister than she's acting to her mother or to her daughter, and therefore there's something wrong with her, right? But that's exactly what authenticity then later says. That's why authenticity rebels against the roles, because the roles are seen as inauthentic, right? They are seeing as just conforming to you just conform to these social roles, these social expectations. You don't have this one core special authentic self, right? So that's where the rebellion from authenticity is against sincerity. And now we see towards the future a rebellion of authenticity towards profilicity, which is very similar, that again, like Zuckerberg says, oh no, you are right. But of course, why does he say it? Only also for his own profile reasons, right? Because he's, he wants to see he operates in a highly individualistic, authentic society. So he wants his own profile of himself, and more importantly of his brand of Facebook, to be somehow authentic, which is entirely paradoxical, which relates again to my previous response to Ciela. We should understand, no, it's not on social media in an age of profilicity, the demand to be authentic is unhealthy, and it's because it's unrealistic. And instead, we should understand that, yes, of course, we have and we must have multiple profiles that are very often, even unlike sincerity, where in sincerity you still had some sort of kind of coherence, right? Because you grow into these naturally from whatever daughter to whatever wife, and then you become mother, and then you become grandmother, and there's some sort of an organic coherence in the family because it all takes place within the same family unit, within present peers. But now we're interacting with kind of completely unrelated general peers in very different spheres. So it's much more complex, and we need these kind of much less coherent profiles. They are less coherent than the traditional roles. But again, this is how society functions. We all function in this way, and we couldn't otherwise function rather than on the basis of multiple profiles, which we have in different spheres. And on top of that, it becomes even more complex because we're not just prophilic. We're also still at the same time in other contexts sincere and authentic, right? So, and we must understand that that doesn't violate that we are also sincere, means we're inauthentic when we're sincere, but it also means we're not prophilic, right? And that's all okay, right? And that's, I think, something we need to learn and accept rather than insist on the authenticity paradigm.
Does that mean that, does that connect to what Peter said about how the ego could be sold, and perhaps Zuckerberg could also sell to each person who is only one person that advertisers can target? Yeah, that's actually very interesting. There could be a connection there too. It's like, if you are only one person all the time, then there is, you can be pegged, you can be put in a hole, you can be pigeonholed as only one thing that you can be. And maybe if you can escape that into multiple alt profiles, that would help you escape being what you might call legible.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's wonderful.
Sweet. So maybe we have time for one more question. And Rasha asked a question, really interesting question, but she had to leave. But Laura asked a kind of question that's aligned with that. So I'll ask Laura to ask their question.
Oh, thank you. So I'm curious because it seems like the identity that we're talking about here is not really an identity so much as it's an ad of ourselves. And this is really reinforced by the fact that most of these contexts are places where advertising is not just present, but sort of the reason for these platforms to even exist. And so it's like ads and then ads of ourselves rather than actual identities, which really come into play in relational spaces.
Right. So yes, I mean, there is a connection, a strong connection, I guess, with advertising, which I already at least somewhat addressed when I was talking about the relation between the brand and the profile, right? So there is this relation with advertising. But again, I would just not focus it. And in marketing, it was because very strong, right? The formation of a brand, this switch from whatever, just selling shoes to selling branded stuff, right? No one looks at a shoe simply as a shoe anymore, right? They look at the shoe in terms of their brand. And again, I think that is something that it has not only happened in advertising. I gave the other example, for instance, in my profession, in the academic system, where it's very important, not basically what I write, but where I publish it. And that's again, that's why I'm introducing the concept of second order observation. We can look at advertising and then via the brand understand the notion of second order observation, right? Again, we don't just see a shoe, we see a Nike shoe, right? So we already see the shoe in terms of its brand. And my point is that this is not just the case in advertising, that this is the case in all social systems, including, I just gave you the example of the academic industry. And again, like in my response to the previous remarks, I don't think we should say this is bad and we just need to go back to authenticity, and we need to kind of impose this notion of everything should just, we don't want second order observation, we just want first order observation, because this is the real thing. And I do not think so, right? I do not think so that second order observation is less true than first order observation. It's just, and we just need to, no matter which mode of observation we're in, the point is not to, so to speak, find out the true form of observation, but that's again my Taoist thing, but finding a sane way, a kind of a sane way of operating in these kinds of observation. And in many ways, second order observation, as I showed with the two photos, is much more complex. It's therefore also, to go back to what Peter said, it has much more creative potential. It's more complex. It has a lot of potential to do stuff with ourselves, with our own identity, that we can't do in the mode of first order observation. And I think the point is not to say, oh no, we should go back to first order observation and everything in second order observation is false, but we should understand it better, and then try to learn to both individually and collectively to operate it with it creatively, productively, sanely.
I wonder if there's something that isn't so much about going back to something that is impossible at any rate, even if it was desirable, but instead to think about what are the then effects, net effects of those kinds of identity creation, not just culturally, which I think there's a huge impact, but also what does belonging look like in that kind of paradigm? Because I think there's a real difference between the sort of artistic impression or branding of myself or whatever it may be that's happening when we're talking about these localized identities or, whatever. But if we're talking about where do we belong, and we are fracturing ourselves and creating this image of ourselves, then there probably needs to be some, maybe again, not a return, but another space that allows for that to be more possible.
Right. I agree. I mean, maybe I'm not really highlighting this enough. I do think that just as there is still a space, important space for sincerity, there's also still an important space for authenticity. And that's maybe what you mean, or in my language, when you talk about belonging in your language. In my language, this is kind of an authentic. I think you're talking about an authentic belonging. And just as we can still be sincere, we can also still be authentic and have authentic belonging. So it doesn't go away, but it's not everything, and it shouldn't be the monopoly. And we shouldn't, just as we should kind of be glad that we can have authentic belonging, but we can also have artistic profile creation, and we can have also sincere, also kind of belonging, sincere commitment to traditional roles. So yeah, I agree with you. I also like authentic belonging, but at the same time, and again, like right now, I mean, it's wonderful that we can interact and so forth. right now. We never met before. We will probably never meet again. And we still have a very meaningful conversation about authentic belonging, but we're not authentically belonging right now.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of the last chapter of your book with your co-author Paul, where you talk about switching between these different sincerity, authenticity, profilicity, and they kind of need to they're always going to be there.
Right.
There was a question about embodiment. I just we're going to wrap up, so I'll let you go soon. Yeah, by the way, do you have any like final words or anything that came alive for you during your stay at the Stoa, or any other thing you'd like to stress finally?
No, I can't think of anything right now. Maybe you wanted to say something about
Okay,
body?
okay. I just want to, because someone brought it
Maybe I'll
up. So
finish on that.
about the body, right? So
Yeah.
I wanted to write this book a long time ago called Digital Demons, and one of the demons was the double. And the double kills you at the end of every movie, in all those tropes. I don't know if you're familiar with those movies about the double. Like they go back for like generations.
Right.
This idea of this you find this double who looks like you, and then
Right.
you kill them, but then you end up dying. So there's like this psychoanalytical tradition about it. Anyway,
Yes.
so the point is I wanted to bring up was what happens to the body when the center of gravity of the self shifts closer towards this online space.
Right.
Is there like a conflict with the body and the present self, let's say? Does it get neglected? You talk about narcissism, and I like how you push back on the moralism against it. But narcissism comes from narcosis, and it's like when you project yourself into these media, maybe you forget, you become numb to your body. Does that make sense? Maybe that's a little bit of an out there question, but I just want to get you to think about the body. What does effect does this have on our relationship with the body?
Yeah, the body is of course important and has always been very important, and there's been a lot of attention back to the body in the past few decades, starting whatever with Foucault and then with feminism strongly, and I think that's a good thing, and it's important. Merleau-Ponty phenomenology, and so my view of the body is also centered on this understanding of the incongruity. I think bodies are incongruent. Now we have a lot of talk about gender, and basically what I think is good about this is that we understand the contingency and the incongruity of our body. There, we can see it at least. There's also a problem with too much emphasis on authenticity. Whatever. I feel, unfortunately, my problem is not so much a gender problem, but an age problem. I think I'm inhabiting a body that is too old for my mind, and right, that is not congruent with how I mentally feel. When I dream, I'm always like 20. I inhabit a 20 or 30 years old body, but then I wake up and I inhabit almost 60-year-old body, and that's a big challenge. So. And then, of course, there are so many other aspects about the body that are incongruent, right? We had the long focus politically on race and so forth, right? And then again, like gender. But so that for me, if reflecting on the body, I think it is important simply to acknowledge the, let's say, strange or odd incongruity of our bodily existence. And again, I don't think we can, so I'm making the same philosophical move here that I made earlier. I don't think we should somehow be focused on either making the body congruent, because that's impossible. right? And I think that's whatever now in the transgender thing, maybe also something that I find philosophically problematic, right? That we have, again, we have this authenticity domination. We want, so to speak, to make the body and the mind, that's traditional, congruent, but they can never be congruent. And so we have to kind of learn, I guess, everyone to somehow accept and deal with and be at ease with the incongruity of our bodily existence. And so I also do not think there is like this, I also don't like this kind of just being, you know, leaving the body behind and idealizing the online existence and just being, you know, transforming your whatever, putting a computer chip and you just exist online or so. Again, I don't think that's also like another example of the attempt to kind of dissolve the incongruity of the body by simply abolishing the body, right? And then you don't have to, you know, deal with the incongruity of bodily existence. But yeah, I would just, you know, my general response is that, yeah, bodies are incongruent, and they can never be congruent, and that's just the way it is. And it can still be in many ways, it is still in many ways also not just, but also enjoyable to have a body. But it's of course not all just enjoyable. It also comes with a lot of problems. I just mentioned like aging, right? That's a big problem. That's a bodily problem. And everyone's facing that problem existentially. And but at the same time, yeah, again, I think, of course, I prefer having a body over not having a body.
Wow, what a way to end. I'll quote you on that line. I prefer having a body. I just want to say, like, your ideas, and I encourage everyone to read the book, Your Profile and You on Your Profile. I don't know why you didn't put your profile and you just to be provocative, but
all right. Yeah, that's a
but
good
I think everyone should read it. I think a lot of questions we have today, a lot of it is addressed in the book, and it gives us a really good vocabulary to think about these very contemporary, pressing issues that we have today. And before we leave, I just want to plug another event that's coming up in the store soon. And it's in the chat, Wisdom Signaling and Wisdom of Criticism with John Vervaeke, Chris Masterpietro, Chris Kavanaugh, and Matt Bram. And Hans, I just want to say thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I know it's very early in the morning and you woke up and had to do this presentation, but I appreciate you for coming. So thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot for the discussions.
All right. Thanks as always. See you next time.
See you. Bye-bye.